Okay, so Helen, with the most gorgeous handwriting, they have to go soon. They got to go back. So I said I'd do this one first. This was that one. Okay. So Helen's asking a little bit of background here. So she's saying, where Jesus said one stone is not left upon another, right? The Olivet Discourse and what have you. But if you go now down to the Western Wall today, there are evidently stones there. They all pray there and what have you. So Helen's question is, well, in considering that the stones are left, is the place then is the Temple Mount the actual place for the temple? Because everybody's making a big deal about the Dome of the Rock. Okay. So could the Jews be building the temple elsewhere? Because, you know, it's not really, the prophecy as it is not, the stone not being thrown on another is not fulfilled. So how would you answer that question?
I would say there's two ways to answer that. One of them is, there's sometimes people will call Jesus a false prophet because they look around and what you see there is the Temple Mount wall. It covers 35 acres that Herod built. Again, you can go and you can see some of the Herodian stones along the western wall. They're huge, gigantic. But if we get specific, well, I'll step back for a minute. It gets people to say, well, okay, if these walls are still here, therefore either Jesus is a false teacher, which we know he's not, or would that then imply that the temple wasn't located there, that it was located normally down in the city of David, which is south of Jerusalem. So I think if we take the logic of the first question, I would say, well, that's good logic if that is true. But I don't think that is true, so therefore we don't need to go down to the city of David. I'll explain why. When Jesus is walking around, and we know this historically from Josephus and the writings of other first century people, that when Jesus, it says that they were showing him the buildings of the temple itself, not the wall. The wall is really far away from the temple area. Again, it goes very far. And even that wall that Herod expanded goes back to what's known as the Hasmonean period, the Maccabean period, roughly, let's say 100 BC. So they took Solomon's platform in that Maccabean period, and they solidified it. Well, then when Herod came, he did everything magnificent. And so he took it and made it even farther. So when Jesus is walking around and and they are showing, oh, look at this building. The temple itself had some outward buildings to it. So when he says, when you see this temple building and there will not be one stone left upon another, he's not referencing the wall, Herod's outer embankment wall. He's talking about the temple buildings itself. And no doubt, if you go there are no temple buildings at all. In fact, later in the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 AD, they completely razed R-A-Z-E-D. They razed it. They just demolished everything, and they put a new temple there to So the old temple was completely demolished. So if we understand that Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled because he wasn't talking about Herod's wall, his retaining wall, then there would be no reason to look towards the city of David for the temple. But on that's a good question as well, because that's kind of come up in the last 20 years. Back in the 90s, there was a book written by Ernest Martin called The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. And his contention was that what we know as the Temple Mount area was the Antonia Fortress, and that Herod's temple was down in the city of David. But they have done so much excavation down in the city of David, you can go there, and they're continuing. It's just constant. And they have found no evidence at all of a temple being down there, nor of it even being possible because of the size. There's no way you could fit the temple down in that area, and have it match up with the rest of biblical descriptions. But with the archaeology, back in the 90s, you could ask that question, kind of. But now they've done so much excavation, there's no way. So, and even recently, if you've heard of the news, they have been uncovering the pool of Siloam, where the the man born blind was healed by Jesus in John chapter 9. I remember when I was there the first time in the year 2000, I went through Hezekiah's Tunnel, the Gihon Spring, and you came out, and there was this little medieval pool. And I was like, oh, well, what's this? You know, I'm young, I was 25, and like, oh, this is the pool of Siloam. I'm like, oh, this is it, John 9. Not even close, okay? Because archaeologically, later in 2004, they started doing some other work, and they discovered the rest of the steps. And they were like, oh, yeah, we were wrong over there. This is amazing. But what happened, there was a Greek church there, and it was this wall of dirt. The Greek church was there, and the Greek church surprisingly, they wouldn't sell the property and to allow it to be excavated. Well, then, just a few months ago, we were there in March. They had just purchased the property, like in the first part of the year, and they just uncovered the top, like with big bulldozers. Well, now, if you go online, the steps go all the way down, and you're like, yes, this is so beautiful and amazing. And then again, that's down in the city of David, showing again that the temple itself wasn't there. So Jesus is a true prophet. The temple was up there, nothing's left, the prophecy was fulfilled, and again, there's just no room in the city of David, is how I would respond to that.
Okay, amen. Is that all right, Helen? Yeah? And we're just seeing that Mondo is not a false prophet either. That's good. Right, on the temple language, staying on the temple subject, here is Naveen. So he's got 3 questions, but he's going to take one of these, Naveen, okay? I asked him which is the most important one. Here it is. I believe that there will be a 3rd temple in Jerusalem, he says, but I have heard people claim that as written in the letter to Corinthians, we are the temple of God. So instead of the abomination that causes desolation in the 3rd temple, this is what he's heard, it will be, I think we could say, it begins with the shot. It will be vaccines which will corrupt the human body, i.e. the temple of God. How do we counter this argument? So
this is where language, context is super important. I think that there are those that, as we were talking earlier, those that take things literal, those that make things figurative. Well, the Bible, we're not saying the Bible never speaks in figurative language. And so oftentimes those that don't see a future for Israel, or they don't believe really watch prophecy, they will say, what's wrong with you? Why are you reading that there's going to be a temple? Because clearly 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, don't you know that we are the temple of God? That's a plural there. It's talking about the church. Or he says, you are the temple. That's a plural Greek. That the church, the Corinthian church, Paul is telling them that as a body of believers, you are the temple that the Lord dwells in. We agree, of course. I'm not denying that. But again, words have meaning depending on the context. The other place is in the same book, in 1 Corinthians 6:19. There he's talking about the individual, and he's talking about sexual sin. And he says, don't abuse your body, because if you sin sexually, you're sinning not only against the Lord, but you're sinning against your own body. For don't you know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? So there he's speaking about the individual. And so even within Paul, it's in the same book, within a few chapters, you'd have to say, okay, well, one is clearly spiritual, 1 Corinthians 3:16. The other one, he's talking about the body being a temple. So even there's a little bit of a distinction between what he's saying. And then we know in John chapter 2, Jesus says, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. And then John says, well, he was speaking about his own body. So there's no doubt that the body can refer to the temple. The church, the gathered, can refer to the temple, but that's the nature of language. Language has a variety of nuances to it. But when you go to, there's context. So I'm trying to think of, the earliest idea of a temple, a 3rd temple, would be in Daniel 9:27, where it's talking about the 70th week, the last of the 7-year period, and it says, he'll make a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to the sacrifices. And so clearly that's a reference to temple, actual sacrifices. And so there's no reason not to take that in a straightforward, literal way. So you go, oh, well, what's he mean there? Well, that's never been fulfilled in the history. So it has to be, again, Do we know how it's going to be? We say no, but I take it by faith that it's going to happen in the future. So the other thing is, if you go to Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, he's talking about the land of Israel during the tribulation. And he says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Well, he's not using Paul's language. Paul wrote 20 years later about the temple in a figurative way. Jesus is talking, he's there, they're on the Mount of Olives, right across the Kidron Valley is the temple. So Jesus he's not being tricky. When you see the abomination spoken of by the prophet Daniel, see, that tells us, that roots us into, well, what did Daniel have to say? Well, the abomination of desolation appears in the book of Daniel several times, and it refers to Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC coming in and offering a pig on the altar and then wanting to bringing in a statue of Zeus. So that was a real abomination. He put it inside the real physical temple. So when Jesus is saying, when you see that, it's going to happen again, that was just a type, then you need to flee. Well, how do you make that figurative? Is it going to be standing in the middle of the church? Is it going to be standing in the middle of my body? Right? So when you look, it would be forcing these other passages on Matthew 24, which it wouldn't make sense in a lot of ways, especially because Jesus just got done seeing and they were showing him all the buildings of the temple. So that makes sense that that would happen in a physical location. The other thing is, how do we respond? In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it's talking about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord cannot be present unless the apostasy happens first and the man of sin is revealed, who will go into the temple of God and declare himself to be God. Well, that's pretty clear that again, it's a Jewish context there. Paul's writing 2 Thessalonians about 52 AD. The temple's still there. So if you read it in its original context, you would clearly go, oh, the Antichrist is going to go into the temple? Oh, that sounds very similar to the idea of Jesus speaking about the temple being there in a real way. And so those are the ways that I would say that I'm not denying that the word temple can refer again to the church or to the human body, but it also refers to a physical building, a physical place. And so what oftentimes people will accuse us of taking that physical building and forcing it, and we're going, well, it's really the opposite. You're taking this other language and forcing it and then not allowing it. We see also in Revelation 11 that during that period when the two witnesses are out there witnessing, the angel tells him to go measure the temple area. So how do you do that if that's the church? And it's an actual physical area, and he says, leave the outer courts. See, a Jewish person is going to, well, I know what the outer court is. There's a Gentile court, there's an outer court, there's a women's court, there's a Israel court for Israel men. So they would clearly understand the language, but if we force it to be figurative, then we get into some of the strange things about vaccines and other things being in the temple, and I think that's mixing. It's forcing it on there, which we don't need to do.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question here, kind of following on really from what we've all been talking about this morning, about Israel. The question is, how can we encourage Christians that have taken a replacement view to consider a change of mind? So the replacement view is what he was talking about last night and today, wasn't it? That all the promises to Israel and now to the church and bye-bye Israel and it's all for us sort of thing. So that's replacement theology. So how Christians who are thinking that way, how can we encourage them to consider, just to consider a change of mind?
So this is why, especially the message this morning, that's why I really feel strongly about sharing that in a prophecy context. I mean, you could talk about that in a different context, as it relates to maybe studying the Bible. How do we study the Bible? But when it comes to prophecy, I think that's the biggest challenge, is that those that will hold to replacement theology, ultimately, they're taking, for example, I didn't mention it, and I was running out of time, but in Isaiah chapter 11, we see that, we know the passage, that the lion will lay down with the what? The lamb, right? And the lion will eat straw like the ox. See, we read that and we go, figurative. Figurative. Well, how do you take that prophecy and how do you make that figurative? And then you're going to get 20 answers. Well, it's really talking about peace in general. No, I mean, it's pretty clear that the lion is going to lay down with the lamb during the millennial period. And so that's the challenge, is for those that hold to a replacement theology, when it comes to these passages that speak very straightforward, that they will change their swords into plowshares, and we see there'll be no more fighting on all my holy hill. When Zechariah 14, that Jesus comes back, puts his foot on the Mount of Olives, that it splits. Part of it goes to the north, part of it comes to the south. There's a valley that comes in, and a river is formed, and they go, it's all figurative. And okay, just disagree. So in the sense of, because you make no sense of these passages, and so that's why I tried to show that if you were to lovingly, talk to them and then say, well, help me understand how you interpret the Bible, and you go, well, let's go to Micah 5:2, and let's go to 100 BC, before Jesus was born. Okay, you're here reading this, and I always like to say, I'll tell people, your 10-year-old son comes to you, or your 10-year-old daughter. Dad, I'm reading Micah 5:2, and it talks about the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. What does it mean? I can guarantee you that replacement theologian will say, well, that means that he's going to be born in Bethlehem. And you go, oh, so you take that literal. And they're going to have to say yes. So it's kind of a trap, a loving trap to help them. But they will have to say yes because they know that how else. But some of them, see, it's interesting that they make this distinction. If it's a first coming prophecy, they've been trained to think literal. But if it's a second coming, they've been trained to think it goes to the church. And you go, again, when did you change the rules in your own mind? Who taught you to do that? People, you don't learn that unless you've been taught that. So what I would say is, if you're helping them, be nice first. But help them to think about how, in their own thinking, they would not automatically change the Micah 5:2 passage or the virgin birth passage or unto us a son is given, a child is born. We know all these, that he would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Those are all literal things. That he would Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Pierced in my hands and my feet. Are those figurative? See, they're going to say every time, oh no, those are straightforward. So I would just encourage them to examine the way that they understand the first coming and then say, again, where would you get the idea to switch it? And secondly, we have, going back to the other, that God promised that Israel would come back in the latter days. He promised that all Israel would be saved. He promised that 70 weeks are determined for Israel or for Jerusalem and the holy people in that regard. So ultimately, God becomes a liar in one sense. I would be nicer than that, but that's ultimately between us friends. We could say that's kind of where they're going. That's the ultimate ramification. So I would just encourage them to consider how they interpret the Bible, kind of exactly what we talked this morning.
Yeah, I suppose it's critical thinking, isn't it? As opposed to, and your hermeneutic, as opposed to emotional thinking. And I think we get into emotional thinking, don't we? Well, this is my position. I've held this position all my life. I've written all these books. I've done all this. I can't possibly change. But I think if we learn to think critically, joining the dots.
And I would say the last thing is that when you look at is consistently. Yeah. That's the key, is it's consistent to take these prophecies in a normal way. Again, when Jesus said, I'm the door, well, we obviously know. Or Revelation 12, I saw a sign in heaven. It tells you, I saw a sign. And so when you have those languages, just say, hey, we need to be as consistent as possible. I mean, if I wrote a letter to my wife, please go to the store and get me some white milk. And she goes, oh, I know what you mean. Well, you really don't want me to go to the store. And then she comes with an idea, and really, you don't want white milk. You want something pure, and you want something filling, because milk is filling, it has protein. Maybe you want some white chicken. And I was like, well, that's not what I said. But so when you make it figurative or poetic, you can end up anywhere that the person wants to be, when in reality it's just straightforward.
Okay, so this is a clarification question. Somebody said, is this good doctrine? Simple doctrine, right? And it goes, is the rapture for Christian believers and messianic believers who have turned individually to Christ, and the second coming for Israel who turn as a nation at the end of the Great Tribulation?
Okay, that's a very astute question, because especially in what we would call dispensational thinking, futurist thinking, there's always the question of, well, what about Jewish people? So we know that the church, Jesus said, I'll build my church, right? Matthew 16:18. Well, the first people that were involved in the church were Jews, right? Peter, James, John, all of them, they were Jewish people. But later, as Paul goes out and he's called to the Gentile nations, he begins to write, and even before Paul, we see it in Acts chapter 10 with Cornelius, right? Peter goes and the Lord tells him to go over to visit Cornelius, and Peter had a hard time with that. He gets the vision, remember if he gets the vision about the food, and God says, if I've declared it clean, don't contradict me. So Peter goes there and he's like, hey, I'm a little bit uncomfortable here, but the Lord told me to come, and so he ends up sharing the gospel. They get saved. Well, then Peter comes back in Acts chapter 11. He goes up to Jaffa, right? He goes down to Jaffa to visit, and this is where it all happened. Well, he goes back to Jerusalem, and everybody hears that Peter had gone to hang out with the Gentiles. And so they start giving him grief. He goes, hey, he basically says, hey, back off. Okay, the Lord told me to go. Who am I to argue with him? I went down there. They received the Spirit in the same way that we did, a few years ago in Acts chapter 2. And so Peter was used by God to bring in the Gentiles, but then that ministry was passed on to Paul, who then goes out, and we see that his missionary journey in Acts 13. He comes back. Well, in Acts 15, this is the Great Jerusalem Council, the first council that is there, and they're debating back and forth. All that to say that when Paul comes and he's getting revelation from the Lord, in Ephesians chapter 2, he talks about the church, and he says, hey, the Jews and the Gentiles, God is bringing them out of the Jewish unbelievers and the Gentile unbelievers, and the Jews and Gentiles are coming over here, and they're creating one new man, a new body of believers, the church. It's separate. And so if a Jew, right now, we have Messianic believers, we have Gentile believers. We got Christian believers, Jewish believers, you name it, all the different ethnic groups. But the tribulation, at the rapture, the church goes up. God's not making any distinctions between ethnic groups. The church is the church. But during the tribulation period, God turns himself back to focus on the nation of Israel. And so there are those that get saved during the tribulation, and there are different viewpoints, but I do think that those people that get saved during the tribulation period that are Gentiles, they're not part of the church. They're believers. They're Gentile believers, just like you had maybe in the Old Testament or even other times. Let's say before Abraham, Noah's a Gentile. He wasn't Jewish. Enoch, he's not Jewish. So you have believers in ancient times. So I think that during the tribulation period that those people, that they get saved, they're Gentiles, non-Jews. And when Israel does come to that place of salvation at the end, it is on a national level, but it's through, everybody is saved through Jesus. There's no other way around it. And so in that sense, I think that's the little distinction that's being made there, which, will they go up, the Messianic believers? Yes, they're part of the church.
Yes, it's to Israel, to Jerusalem, you will not see me again, right? Mm-hmm. Until you say. So I hope that answers the question. I think that was a good answer. Right, so two slightly off-topic questions, but we can squeeze these in, I think. On that same thing then, how do Jews believe sins are dealt with since 70 AD and rejecting their Messiah? Well, I think that there's a big debate. We won't get into all of the debate as it relates to what the Jews... The Jews...
under the Old Testament, oftentimes we think that the Jews believed that they were saved by works, which isn't necessarily true because there was righteous Jews, right? I mean, Daniel was righteous and others, King David and Hezekiah. And God gave the sacrificial system, and we know from Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4, that the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. However, God still said, I'm going to give you this ritual. And if you do it by faith, then you'll receive forgiveness, right? Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. So Paul makes that whole argument in Romans 4, all the way through the book of Romans, that faith was always the instrument that God gave forgiveness, starting with Abraham. But then when it came to the law, God said, okay, one of the ways that you're going to express faith is by doing your sacrifice. And that's why when we come to the New Testament, it's the Jews rejected, I think they lost their way there, because in Romans 10, it says that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. And it says that they sought, instead of receiving righteousness by faith, they decided to do righteousness by their own way. And so they did reject. They rejected the mechanism. That's why Paul, he's writing to the Jews, and he brings them up in Romans chapter 2, but he reminds them, go back to Abraham. You guys, you're children of Abraham. This isn't anything new. This has been in the Bible. So today, for the average religious Jew, the secular Jew, they don't even care. Okay, just like secular people today, they might not care. But a religious Jew, they're thinking, this is why I wrote the Red Heifer book as well, because I document in there, what does a Jewish person think today? And not that I agree with the Red Heifer. I'm not saying I agree with any. I was just trying to explain, what do they think? And how do we respond to how they're approaching it? Because for them, I mean, it's similar to what they said to Jesus in John 5. Well, we don't know who you are. We follow Moses. And Jesus says, if you followed Moses, you would follow me because he wrote about me. So let's get that straight. So don't think that you can get that's going to work. In fact, Moses is going to speak against you on that day. So, but for the Jewish person today, their whole context is we got to go back to Moses. We got to go back to Moses, which Moses is the temple. Moses is the one that gave all the Levitical laws, all the temple laws. So they're going back to their default, which is their rejection of Jesus in the first century, and then their resistance to the church, to the message. And they, for 40 years, they still sacrificed at the temple until God said enough, and he removed the temple. But for them, they have that short memory that they're just going to go, nope, we're going to go back to what we know. What do we know? We're going to go back to doing it the temple way. And you go, that's what the whole book of Hebrews is about. It's not that we look at the sacrificial system, and we got to be careful that it wasn't evil. God's the one that put it there. But he put it there to point them to the work of Jesus on the cross. And so, like, to all people, like, for a Jewish person, you guys have been sacrificing animals for 1,400 years. You should understand, of all people, that something innocent pays for the sin by its blood so that forgiveness can be made. Because in Leviticus 17:11 it says, that life of the flesh is in the blood. I've given it as an atonement on the altar for your soul. Hebrews 9:22 says something, same thing. Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. So the book of Hebrews and Leviticus, they are just together. So the Jews today are going back to what they know. I think what we see God doing is, again, God says, we have an appointment. Tribulation, it's the time of Jacob's trouble. We're going to spend 7 years talking because he's not going to leave them without a witness. The church is gone, but you have the two witnesses that are coming, witnessing to the Jews. You have the 144,000. And what are they going to be saying? This isn't it. You need to follow Jesus. And they're going to resist it, and they're going to continue to build a temple. This isn't going to work for you. You're going to find that he's going to betray you. The Antichrist is going to betray you, and then he finally does. They get ground down. He's going after them. Many of them are perishing through persecution, through martyrdom. And finally, at the end, when they're at the limit, you know, before we pick on them, how many of us, many times, will resist God until we're at the rock bottom? And then we're open. And Job 36, it says that through affliction, God opens our ears. And I resonate with that. So in that way, what we see is that period is going to go, but today they're going back to Moses. Yeah. That's their heart.
I read on that. I read that when the because there was another temple in Egypt, wasn't there? They were allowed to offer sacrifices, but when the Romans burnt the one down, Jerusalem, and then shut the other one down in Egypt, I think it was AD 73 or 75. They had this big council. And they decided, right, the temple's gone, we're not going to do the sacrifices anymore, here's a new system. It was adopting the teachings of the sages and the rabbis, and I think that's why much today, as I understand, and I'm not an expert on this, as I understand, it's, they're following these traditions, like you say, of Moses, and somehow that is getting them good marks, or, God is looking down on them to say yes, well done, good and faithful servant, as we would say, but in fact he's not. He's drawing them to the Messiah.
It's interesting if you read some of the rabbi's theology. So when you offer an offering on the altar, like a real altar, you burn it. Some of us like the smell of barbecue, right? It smells good, but it's burning the fat. So that's part of the offering is the fat. God says you got to leave it all and burn the fat, because that's where the smell comes from. So the Jewish person, when there's no temple, they're going, well, how do you burn fat? You fast. If you fast, you're burning fat. It's the same.
Figurative.
It's the same. So as we fast, and that's as they fast and pray, It's the same thing as an offering. And God's like, I don't think so. But see, this is the way their mind works. And so as they do these things, and it's written down, these are the oral traditions, and you're like, mm-mm.
Okay, that's a good answer. Right, let's get through our final question. So this is directed at PW, shorthand for Prophecy Watchers. So, Mr. Gonzales, why do Prophecy Watchers have a very strong focus on the timing of the rapture, as in pre-trib? What is the motive behind this? And if the rapture is exclusively pre-trib, how does this line up to scriptures that state believers are on earth in the tribulation, such as Revelation? If these believers are on earth in the tribulation, are those who exclusively got saved during the tribulation, as stated by one of your guests? Only then does this mean someone who gets saved a minute, or does this mean someone who gets saved a minute before the tribulation escapes 7 years of wrath, but one who gets saved 1 minute after receives 7 years of wrath? So it's that.
I think that is well said. When you think about the timing, we know that there's a lot of positions out there, and we're not here to tear anybody down. And that's why we don't often spend time at highlighting all the positions. So, I mean, if you can find that anywhere. But as I presented yesterday, the pre-trib position is a promise. It's personal. It has all those. That's why we spend time on that, because we look and we go, well, it's in the scripture, and we see it as being in the strongest of all of the positions, and so that's why for us we're going to focus on that for all these reasons. We're going to just go out there and share the message. If people don't want to, that's fine. But this is what God has called us to do. And so when it comes to one of the often objections is, well, during the tribulation, there's people, there's saints. In Daniel, as well as in the book of Revelation, it talks about there being believers. Well, clearly there are believers during the tribulation, because you have the Bible, and especially the book of Revelation, has that. But you have the 144,000 being saved. You have the two witnesses there. So there's evangelism going on. As we mentioned, Revelation 14, the angels going, sharing the gospel. So there certainly are. One of the key things I didn't bring up was that, and I'll do this probably at our conference, is it talking about the Revelation 3:10 passage, I will keep you from the hour of trial that's coming upon the whole earth to test those who dwell on the earth. That idea of what the keeping from the hour really means, because many times you'll see people say, well, God is going to protect us through. And you go, well, what does that mean? What kind of protection is that? And so when you press people, based on Revelation 3:10 and others, They're going to go, well, it's like the Israelites. Remember in the Old Testament, during the Exodus, the Israelites were protected and their cows were protected, but the Egyptian cows, and then over here, the darkness was on the rest of them, but the darkness wasn't here. Well, if you look in the book of Revelation, the believers, they're getting slaughtered. They're getting martyred. We see that in Revelation 6. We see that in Revelation 7. Revelation 13:7, that the Antichrist is given full permission to go out there and slaughter believers. So this idea of being protected, what I want to say is, well, what do you mean by protection? Because it's not a matter of physical protection. Do you mean physical protection? Well, they can't say yes, because it shows that's clearly not the case. And you go, well, that's spiritual protection. Well, we already had that. We have that as a believer. So really, what encouragement are you giving me that if I get slaughtered and martyred, I'm going to go to heaven? Well, I already knew that. That's the promise is given as I'm going to keep you from the very hour of trial that's coming upon. And so, but what you do see is it is true. If we're to take the logic, the rapture happens, somebody gets saved right there, and boom, the rapture happens. The next minute, somebody gets saved. Yeah, the assumption would be that they rejected 1 minute before, and so God left them with their choice. God isn't forcing anybody. These people are making their choices. But during that period, yes, people will get saved, but most of them are going to perish. I mean, we know again that's what the Bible says about that. And I'll say this too, that many will say, well, in Revelation 6. This is the wrath of man. And then you have in Revelation 12 the wrath of Satan. But I reject that, because if you look at Revelation 6 verse 2, who's the one that opens the seal? Jesus is. And he's using angels. He's using the living creature to do it. Jesus is in control. When Jesus opens it up, he's unleashing the Antichrist. When he opens up the second seal, the beast system, I would say it that way. In the second one, he's unleashing war. He's unleashing famine. Jesus is unleashing death and destruction. That's going to kill a fourth. He's unleashing earthquakes. So not only that, but in Revelation 7, it talks about this group that has come out of the tribulation. It says, these are those that have come out of the tribulation, the great multitude. But what's interesting about it, and I'll talk about this in that other session, but it says, it only appears 3 times in the book of Revelation. Again, words, how does John use words? He's very, I wouldn't say he's tricky, he's very intentional. But it says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. This is Revelation 7. These are those that have come out. The Lord will lead them as a shepherd. He'll wipe away every tear. And the sun will not scorch them anymore. Like, well, wait a minute. Who are these people? They're not protected from the vile judgments, from the bowl judgments. Because they'll say, that's the wrath of God. You go, wait. If you look at Revelation 16, one of the bowl judgments is mankind being scorched. The same word. It's a very strange word that only appears there, which means that those people were being scorched and not protected, even though they were believers. They were believers, but they were not protected from the bowl judgment of God's final wrath. They were just caught up into it. So that proves very clearly that this idea, well, they're protected from man's wrath and Satan's wrath, or they will not be protected from man's wrath or Satan's wrath, but they'll be protected from the bowls of judgment. That's not true, not according to Revelation 7.
And we just had the session about the sun. We saw the picture there, didn't we? Mm-hmm. An angel is going to pour a vial on that big glowing ball of hydrogen, consuming 6 million tons of itself every second. Mm-hmm. It's going to increase the heat. How can God protect anybody on the earth? Because the judgment is on the sun, right? It increases the heat. So, and this is why I think it says in the book, I know sword must go to the sword. He to captivity must go to captivity. So, and here is the patience and endurance of the saints. In other words, you're going to have to go through this period now because you did not receive me then, but there is an opportunity in this great tribulation period where you can receive me, and he will rescue. He will eventually come and rescue them. They go to the throne of God. But yes, ultimately,
if they survive,
it is.
If they survive to the end,
it is a minute and a minute.
Yeah.
It is.
That's
It
why
is.
it's so serious. I think
That's what the trumpet is.
that's why we share the gospel. There's a sense of urgency. Hey, I mean, nobody wants their loved ones. I mean, I'd rather see them to be saved and martyred and go to heaven forever. That's good. But what's better? That they get saved and they get to, like Jesus said, pray that you'd be in a position to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. Hey, guys, that's what you got to do.
Yeah, that's good. Didn't he do well? Yeah. He's through to the next round. So thank you, Mondo. Okay, so...